So this is a 45-year-old male. The report came in as an alert. The transmission came across with an alert on it for AFib. Now, the device was originally implanted for syncope. The patient had syncopized 3 times in the past, and they were looking for the reason for that. So they weren't actually looking for AFib. So this came across, and when I opened it, the first thing I noticed was how irregular the rhythm is. So when you're looking to determine, is this a sinus rhythm or is this AFib, first thing you look at is how irregular is it? That doesn't always necessarily mean that it's an AFib, but that's your first clue to point you in the AFib direction. So then with the St. Jude device, you can go in and you can expand the EGM. So you can, because on here, you can't necessarily tell whether there's P waves or not. So you can go on to the next slide. It'll show you where you can blow it up. And when we blow it up, then you can see that there's no discernible P waves on this. So now I'm thinking this is definitely AFib. In addition to this AFib episode, which was 2.5 hours, this patient also had 4 tachy detections that came in on the same day at around the same time. So I looked at all of those. In addition, you could see that the tachy episodes were AFib with RVR. So the last thing I went in to look at was the plot graph. I don't always use the plot graph necessarily. When you look at it, if it shows a lot of irregularity, that doesn't necessarily mean it's an AFib, but based on the expanded EGM and this plot graph, how they start out very stable, probably in a sinus rhythm, and then it gets very erratic and it comes on suddenly, that is classic AFib plot graph. So we alerted the clinic to this because the patient was not on an OAC, and they immediately started them on an OAC for this. So initially, this is not what they were looking for. They were actually, the patient had a history with a Holter monitor where they had picked up some NSVT episodes, and they figured that that might be the reason that he was passing out. But then they found this. So it's always good to, keep your eyes open to everything that comes across with these transmissions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tammy. And we decided to start with this strip because this is pretty classic AFib, right? If we look at the first piece, sure, it's irregular, but there are no P waves, and you can't tell, well, are there no P waves because they're not there, or are there no P waves because, ILRs are limited. They don't always show P waves. So utilizing the other tools so that we can truly feel confident and to say, yes, this is AFib. And again, looking into the patient's history to see, hey, they're not anticoagulated, in this classic plot graph showing the total irregularity, no discernible pattern to the ventricular rhythm. This was pretty clear-cut atrial fibrillation. So moving on from the first case study, let's go into case study number 2, which is going to be a little bit less clear-cut. So Shand, if you want to talk about this patient, that'd be great.
Hi, everybody. So this came in as an AF detection. It's a Medtronic ILR that was implanted for cryptogenic stroke. So we are looking for AFib or other atrial arrhythmias that could lead to a stroke. Could you click one?
Sure.
Forward? So I like to look at the plot graph first. When you look at this graph right here, it looks pretty regular throughout. I know there's some points here and there, but largely, when we see that on a plot graph, it indicates some sort of ectopy going on. And then if you look at the strip that's included with this plot graph, the first few beats, we can pick out something that looks like a discernible P wave. Right after that T wave, that second peak that we see could be, we could think that is a P wave. But you really don't know until you use that gain tool. So could we do next slide? So here's that same strip, but it's blown up quite a bit, 2 to 3 times. And, we can get a little bit more of an insight of what's going on in between those R waves. So if you look at the end of the first line inside of this red box, what we didn't see when the episode wasn't gained up is pretty clear now. We can see a sawtooth pattern, which indicates a likely atrial flutter. And then if you look on the bottom strip, in between those R waves, there's not much going on. There could be some low amplitude sawtooth waves happening, but there's no discernible P wave. So it's a good idea once you gain this up to look at areas where the R to R interval extends. When you see that, a little bit of an extension of the R to R, you can see what's going on in between the T wave and the next R wave. In areas where the rate is faster, sometimes those AFib waves or flutter waves can be hidden in the T wave. So it makes it just a little bit harder to diagnose. So once you blow it up, then make sure you look into those intervals that are a bit more extended. And then on the next slide, it just shows you a comparison. The original strip is up top, and then the gained up strip is on the bottom. And you can see it's a lot easier to see what's going on once you gain that strip up and look in between those R to R. So this is likely ATAF. We like to use that umbrella term. The patient was not anticoagulated, so we escalated this to the clinic. And then within a few days, they had a prescription for OAC.
All right, great. Thank you, Shannon. I think, another point to call out on this strip that you really appreciate when the gain is increased is those things that we thought were P waves on the original kind of smaller gained down strip start to become a little bit more suspicious to me because the morphology is changing from beat to beat. The PR interval is changing a little bit. So they're starting to not really behave like typical P waves. So, bringing in, looking at the intervals when the intervals stretch out, we don't see consistent P waves, or we see these other sawtooth waves. And then again, those things that we thought were P waves, I'm starting to think maybe those aren't P waves after all, and they're just kind of disguising as P waves. So, I know the first time I looked at this strip, between the strip and the plot graph, I jumped to the conclusion, hey, this is probably sinus rhythm with symechtopy, not truly AFib. The device got it wrong. But now using these tools, we're better able to care for the patient, which is really the number one, our number one priority here is to get them protected from stroke, because using all of the tools, this is definitely looking like it's not just a sinus rhythm with ectopy for sure. Okay. Great. So let's go on to case study number 3.
Kate, as you move into 3, quick
Sure.
question here. I know we brought up twice. We've got 2 scenarios here that patients were escalated. We got them on oral anticoagulants. For Shannon and Tammy, how do you normally communicate with your clinics? I know if you're working in the clinic, Shannon, you were in the clinic, you were working right there, you immediately had access to make things happen for getting the right changes for the patient. Now you're remotely removed, providing these services. Maybe share with me a little bit or the group how you communicate with your clients and let them know when they have actionable items.
So we use a HIPAA compliant chat. So we can send quick messages to the clinic if something is concerning. If we need something to be addressed pretty immediately, then we'll give them a call as well. So we're usually on a direct line to the clinic, whether we use that chat or we just go ahead and call the clinic.
Sure. And do you have a dedicated point of contact with inside of your clinics of who you specifically reach out to? Is that a sort of a best practice relationship you set up with your partners?
Yeah, we have a point person that we talk to for anything that's tier 1 or tier 2.
Great. Thank you. I just wanted to address that. Kate, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem. Love the dialogue. Yeah, so, as we talked about with this second case study patient, at first glance, you might, if you're not using the systematic approach and using all of your tools, you might look at this and say, hey, this is pretty clearly, sinus rhythm with ectopy. And in this case study number 3, you'll see is a, slightly different thing happens. So this is kind of contrasting to case study number 2. So Shannon, I'll let you talk about this patient again, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. So here we have another plot graph. This one's quite different than the one that we just saw. This one has a ton of irregularity. There's a few areas here and there where it regularizes, but most of the time this is what we usually see in AFib strips. We see a plot graph that looks like this. If you look down at the ECG, can't really tell what's going on. There's a lot of low amplitude R waves. And then baseline, we're not seeing much, no P waves, no flutter waves, no variable baseline. So if you switch over to the next slide, this is the same strip, but we've blown it up quite a bit using that gain tool. Again, that gain tool is absolutely imperative. So what we thought was originally atrial fibrillation actually turned out to be sinus rhythm, maybe a little bit of sinus tachycardia, but we can see clear discernible P waves here, which allows us to rule out atrial fibrillation. And this patient was implanted for suspected AFib. So, it's super important to have that gain tool. And then also to look, again, look for areas where that R to R has extended quite a bit. And you should be able to see what's going on within the strip.
Yeah, great. So, the previous strip, I think if you weren't utilizing all of your tools, you could have jumped to the conclusion that it wasn't atrial fibrillation, and then that patient maybe isn't getting the protection with OACs that they need. But on the other hand, same thing happens on this one. If you jump to the conclusion that this is AFib, now the patient's on, potentially unnecessary medication, which of course comes with potential complications. So even though we're looking for AFib, we don't necessarily want to find it if it's not truly there. So, this is a really good example of where that plot is a little bit deceiving, because there's just some natural irregularity with their rhythm. We're seeing a lot of ectopy, but again, not jumping to conclusions, using all of our tools, using that systematic approach, we can see, nope, there are clear P waves in this. So this is sinus in origin. It's definitely not AFib, which is, good for the patient.